Okay, Shavua Tov, everybody. Welcome to part 4 of part 5, actually, of the Torah Motion series. How to read a book, how to study a book with Rabbi Leibtag. Always who kicks off our week, gives us a beginning of a Shavua Tov. So, okay, Vakasha, and Rabbi Leibtag, it's all yours. You can get started.
Okay, so today's topic, again, I could really call it a Shir on Parshat Shavua, even though that's not the purpose of the class, but it's been turning out that way, sort of halfway on purpose. But the main thing I want to demonstrate, and I want to do it now because people have been going to shul and are familiar with the Parshiot, I want to give an example of, again, how to study Book of Chumash. And today's main topic, I can share my screen now. Let's share my screen real fast. Here we are. Where are we? Okay, that's class number 4, how to study a book. And it's called Chronological Considerations in Study of Units, meaning everyone knows there's always this argument whether Chumash is in chronological order or not, where Ramban is a big champion of whenever possible keeping it in chronological order. Where in many Midrashei Chazal and many Parshanim like Ibn Ezra are very quick, when it's thematically, not what's convenient, but when it's thematically what's necessary, they're easily willing to change the chronological order of the Psukim. It doesn't mean that Chumash is just random, but rather, and that's what I want to try and prove today when you study units. Anyone who wants to appreciate why Chazal hold Ein Mukdam U'Char B'Torah, that Chumash doesn't necessarily not develop, but proceed in chronological order, it's thanks to the study of units you can appreciate it. So we'll see today when we identify units, how understanding units can help us understand Chazal's opinion that sometimes things are out of order, and then we have to understand what Chumash is doing and why it's out of order. So let's do our little intro. So last week we studied the Mishkan unit. We spent 2 weeks on that. We identified the unit in one shir and found God spoke to Moshe 6 times, and Moshe goes up to basically get the laws of the Mishkan. And then last week we went into that unit and saw its internal structure and why the Mizbach Tort and the 6 little short units were left out, and try to give reason for everything. Today we're going to close that Mishkan unit. Just keep it in mind, but we're going to study now the next unit called the story of the sin of the golden calf. That's chapters 32 through 34. And I want to show you basically, and that's the goal of today's share, is that if you really want to study and understand the sin of the golden calf, if you don't take into consideration its continuation from the previous unit of Matan Torah, you'll probably miss many of the key points. So there's 2 things involved. It's not just a continuation of the end of Parshat Mishpatim, like we talked about in our first show. I'll explain that in a minute. It's not just that chapter 32 continues chapter 24, but there's things going on from chapter 19 through 24, basically in the whole unit of Matan Torah, that are going to help us understand what's happening in Parshat Ki Tisa. So I'm going to begin with a quick review, just what we did like 2 weeks ago when we identified the Mishkan unit. Let me just quickly share my screen. I want to share my Tanakh, I'm sorry. Where's my Tanakh? Is over here. That's not it. Here we go. In the end of Shemot Perek Avdallah, we'll see this inside. Remember, Moshe goes up to the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights after God told him, come up the mountain, I'll give you Luchot Evan. And the main pasuk, as we'll see in a minute, he tells the elders, stay here until I come back. We'll see this all in detail in a minute. And what we explained last week is that if I'm following the camera of the camp, what's happening on the camp, the people see Moshe Rabbeinu. The people see Moshe Rabbeinu going up the mountain, like into a ball of fire. And Chumash tells us Moshe was there for 4 days and 40 nights. From chapter 25, God speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu all the way to the end of chapter 31. That's the unit we discussed in the last 2 weeks. At the end of chapter 31, after God speaks, Chumash tells us that when Moshe was up on the mountain, God gave him the 2 tablets. And then in chapter 32, we're going to start the story of Chet HaEgel, which we're going to go down in detail. So basically what I want to do today, and now I'll go back to my main source sheet. Let me just check the chat real fast. Okay, we have the source sheet. Very good. Is up. Share screen and Adobe. Here we are. We reviewed the units and simply take a look. I have this little 4 boxes here. Basically, what I tried to show you is that here. We studied this unit of Mamad Har Sinai, chapters 19 to 24. And we're going to read today from here right to here. We're going to go from 24 to 25, because this camera over here, this camera is up on Har Sinai. So if I'm simply following the camera of Am Yisrael in the desert, I have to read from here to here. It's not just a continuing narrative, there will be a very strong thematic connection. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go back and review the end of chapter 23 and all chapter 24 as the introduction to understanding the story of Chet HaEgel. You'll see it right away how obvious it is. Now remember, in the Kot Tamar unit, let me clear my drawings and move back to my mouse. Remember we had that Kot Tamar unit where God spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, the end of, from right after the Ten Commandments, all the way through the end of chapter 23. God was speaking to Moshe to tell that to the people. It was 90% of it was laws. We gave a whole shir about how those laws were. We identified the unit called the Kot Tamar unit and showed how the laws between God and man enveloped the laws between man and man, and that came together with the Ten Commandments. At the very end of that unit, while God is still talking to Moshe Rabbeinu to relay these laws to the people, it ends with a conditional promise. And that's where we're going to begin from later, and we'll see how this is the introduction to the sin of the golden calf. So we're going to start here and play Clue, if you remember that game. Again, God here, pay attention, is not talking to Moshe. He's talking through Moshe to the people. Technically speaking, he's talking now to Moshe, but he's telling Moshe to tell this to the people. So keep that in mind as we read this. What's God saying? Hinei anochi sholech malach lefanecha, lishmorcha baderech ulavecha lamakom asher achinoti. God tells Moshe to tell the people, I'm going to send a malach before you, not before Moshe, but before the people, to guard you and bring you to the land I'm getting ready, to the place I'm getting ready. Understand why it's so important? God's not talking to Moshe about, God's not saying, I'm going to send Moshe, I'm going to send you a malach, but rather, God tells Moshe, tell this to the people, I'm going to send a malach for the people. Now, there's two ways to read this word. I could read malach or malach, meaning what? A malach, for the sake of analogy, a malach is what I call an angel, like on the drawings you have, and sometimes in churches you have those drawings with angels on the wall, things like that. You know, basically a non-human, some type of angel kind of thing. Or a malach can be someone sent by God, what they call malachi mamash, like real people. Now, the question is God sending something supernatural, not physical, or rather, is God going to send a person? No. So to guard you on the way and bring you where? To the place I got ready. Remember this name, the place I got ready for you. First, the word makom. If you remember in Sefer Bereshit, in Yaakov's dream, hamakom is already something important from them. In Sefer Devarim, remember hamakom asher yivchar Hashem? So calling the land of Israel hamakom in itself is important. But notice the land of Israel is the place that God got ready for us. This pasuk will come back to haunt us later on in Parshat Kitisa. Now, what's God tell Moshe? Tell the people, Hishamer b'panav v'shma b'kolo, make sure to listen to this malach and obey him. Don't rebel against him. Why? Ki lo yisal pishechem. This message I'm sending doesn't have the right or the ability to forgive you for your sins. Why? Ki shmi b'kirbo, because when that messenger, when that malach speaks, it's as though I'm speaking. And he proves it in the next line. Ki'im shema tishma b'kolo. If you obey whatever this malach tells you, and hence vasita kol asher daber, and by doing thus, you'll follow what I'm saying, meaning whatever this malach says is though it's God speaking, then your enemies will be my enemies and your adversaries will be mine. Basically, if you want me to help you conquer the land, you better listen to this malach. And then finally, ki elech malachi lefanecha, this malach will lead the way and bring you to the land of the seven nations and you'll destroy them. Now, if you heard this from God through Moshe Rabbeinu, who would you assume this malach is going to be? Someone answers this real quick to make sure you're following what I'm getting at. Who's the most obvious candidate to be this malach? Yeah,
Moshe.
Of course, Moshe. Why? Because he speaks on behalf of God, doesn't he? He's telling them to obey them. He can punish them, and he's been executing punishment on behalf of God ever since they left Egypt. He's helped them defeat. He's been military assistance, coming out of Egypt, crossing the sea and everything. And it only makes sense that Moshe is the malach. And that's what everyone's assuming. There's no reason why they would assume otherwise. Anyone remember where Moshe Rabbeinu himself is called a malach? Where God says that I send a malach to take you out of Egypt? I'll just show you something cute, just for trivia. If you have a Chumash open up Sefer Bamidbar Perek Chaf, right after Moshe and the rock. If we do a real quick, I'll do it the easy way. If you go to Sefer Bamidbar Perek Chaf, the second half of the Perek, Moshe wants to travel through the land of Edom. What does he tell the king of Edom? Okay. Sorry, right over here. Vaishlach Moshe Malachim Mikadesh Ad Melech Edom, chapter 20 in Sefer Bamidbar. Kol Mar Hashem, in the name of God, Moshe sends a messengers to Kadesh, to the king of Edom. And here what happened. What did God do? We came down to Egypt. We were in Egypt for many, many years. And Egypt was mean to us. Okay. We cried out to God. God sent a malach and took us out of Egypt. Who's a malach? That's Moshe Rabbeinu, isn't it? So we see that even in Chumash itself, Moshe is referred to as a malach. Just one quick example. Keep that in mind. You'll see how important it's going to be in a second. Okay, now back to our story. God will lead the way, and then we'll skip all the psukim. When you come, make sure not to bow down to those gods. Make sure to serve God instead. God will bless you if you do serve Him. And when you come in, then don't make treaties with those nations. So that's number one. That was the end of chapter 20. That's the end of chapter 23, and that Moshe relates to the people. Right afterwards, and you can argue whether this story happened before or after the Ten Commandments, but we have to pay attention to. You have to put yourself in the position of the people living at the time to understand what's about to happen before the sin of the golden calf, what will lead to it. So remember, Moshe comes down either before or after the Ten Commandments, tells the people all the words of God in the Mishpatim, okay? And Moshe writes them down. But then we have a ceremony. What happens? Moshe writes down the words of God. He builds an altar at the bottom of the mountain. We have the ceremony we talked about. There's a symbol of God or a symbol of our connection to God and the connection between the 12 tribes and God in front of the Mizbeach. So we have a Mizbeach in front of some type of monument. Okay? And we bring korbanot. We have basically a fleischer kiddush with olot and shlamim, with burnt offerings and peace offerings, which people eat. There's a ceremony where they sprinkle the blood. Everyone says Nasa v'nishma. Moshe reads the covenant out loud. Moshe sprinkles the blood on the people. We've read this before. And now listen carefully. Moshe, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and 70 elders of Israel go up the mountain, sort of accepting this covenant on behalf of the people. And to our amazement, Vayiru et Elohei Yisrael, they saw the God of Israel. Now, is that plural or singular? Anyone want to comment on that? Elohei Yisrael?
Isn't it smichut?
What? It's smichut, but how could you understand it?
Elohim shel. Yeah.
So it could be Elohim Shel Yisrael or the El Shel Yisrael. What makes more sense?
Singular.
No.
It says raglav, tachat raglav.
Raglav is plural, right?
His raglayim, one person's raglayim, not raglayim.
But one person has two. But one person has two legs. If it's like a person, or if it's a cow, it's 4 legs. We'll say.
But it has to be a singular person, not ragleihem.
Tachat raglav. Okay. I'm saying, but just keep in mind this phrase Elohei Yisrael. Got it? They saw the God of Israel, and they saw this God of Israel, whatever that means. And keep that in mind. We'll get to it later. And despite this, or nonetheless, what happened? They were able to see God, and they ate and they drank the korbanot. Basically, at this point, no one gets punished. Maybe they did even nothing wrong. Again, an argument among the commentators. But remember the ceremony, because we're going to have something very similar at the sin of the golden calf, because there could be a mizbeach by the golden calf. There'll be korbanot. We have the phrase the God of Israel, and the people will be eating and drinking. Keep that in mind. Again, I'm trying to show you that if I want to appreciate Chet HaEgel and what happens, we have to keep this story in mind because it's what happened several weeks earlier before their sin. And then this we talked about many times. Moshe afterwards, after the whole event, for sure after the Ten Commandments and Parshat Mishpatim, Moshe goes up to the mountain to get Luchot Even, the Torah and the Mitzvah, and he tells the elders, keep this in mind, before Moshe goes up for the first 40 days, he tells the elders, stay here until we return. And if any problems, go to Aaron and Hor. They'll be with you. Any problems, they're your babysitters. Aaron and Hor, Moshe's helpers. When they fought Amalek, remember Aaron and Hor held up his hands, and they've been the assistant leadership ever since. Remember, God told Moshe, come up the mountain to Hayesham and be there. That's for more than a day or two. But Moshe doesn't tell the people when they're coming back. Moshe goes up the mountain. He goes into the cloud. And then the most important for us, Umarek Kvod Hashem, what God looked like to the people was like a burning fire on top of the mountain to the eyes of all Israel. So the people saw Moshe going into a cloud of fire, and that's the last thing they saw of him for the next 40 days. Moshe goes into the Anan, and then Chumash tells the reader, Moshe was there 40 days and 40 nights, but in Pshat, Moshe doesn't tell the people, I'll be down in 40 days. And God didn't tell Moshe, I'll be up for 40 days. And Moshe didn't tell Aaron he'll be gone, how long he'll be gone for. He says, I'm gone ad asher nashuv alechem, until we come back. Now, I want to point out something. Two things. One is, in our previous year, we took the Har Sinai camera, and that took us through chapters 25 and 31. Therefore, from our point of view, the next pasuk, as far as the people are concerned in the campus, chapter 32. And then the people see Moshe is delayed. Before we read this, I want to go for a second to Sefer Dvarim, and I want to recall in Sefer Dvarim. Again, Moshe is telling the story 40 years later, but he's telling a story that happened at Har Sinai. Listen to the people's description of Har Sinai to Moshe Rabbeinu that the Moshe retells in chapter 5 in Sefer Dvarim, right after the Ten Commandments. Remember, after Lo Tachmod, again, chapter 5 in Dvarim, you heard all these things from God, and God wrote them down in Luchot. And when you heard this God's voice, you got all scared, and you saw, and listen carefully what the people say. They tell Moshe, V'ata lama namut, why should we die in tochleinu ha'esh hagdola azot? This great fire. I'm sorry, I should go back a pasuk. The people told Moshe Rabbeinu, we saw God, His glory. But kolosh shomanu mitoch ha'esh. We heard His voice coming from the fire, and we saw it is possible to survive. But if we any more, we'll die. If what? We'll be eaten by this fire. Any more will be consumed by this fire. They're sure that this fire will consume them and they'll die. Why? No normal human being could survive this fire and stay alive. Instead, you, Moshe Rabbeinu, you seem to be some superhuman, some have this great capability. You go and listen to what God says, and you'll tell us whatever God says, and we'll follow. Remember, and God listens, etc. The main point I want to make is the people, in the eyes of the people, standing on Har Sinai in the fire of Har Sinai is something a human can endure. They thought Moshe can endure because Moshe has some special status. But they themselves think that being in that fire is not something that a normal human can endure. Keep that in mind now. And let me just check the chat. No, it says, Sab was asking, the people were able to see Moshe go up the mountain. It says so. Let's go back and show you. There was a question, weren't the people far away? The people stood at a distance, but they were able to see Moshe. Let's go back and take a look. What's it say? Moshe goes up the mountain, remember? Moshe goes up the mountain, and the vision of God, right, of God's glory was like a fire on the mountain, on top of in the eyes of all Israel. And Moshe goes into the Anan, and they see Moshe going up, and Moshe leaves them. I don't know if they saw Moshe Mamash going into the cloud itself, but Moshe says, I'm going up to the mountain. I think I understand the question now. It doesn't say they saw Moshe go into the fire, but they saw Moshe leave them, saying he's going up the mountain. But the top of the mountain was a consuming fire behind the cloud. So maybe they saw him go into the cloud, but they also saw consuming fire. And therefore, they assumed that Moshe could survive it. But if 40 days pass and he doesn't come down, there's a good reason for them to think that he didn't survive the fire. Now, I'm making the word Vayar blue on purpose, relating to sight a little bit, the blue. But the Vayar doesn't mean to see in the physical sense, but rather they understood. They reach a conclusion. Like in English, like you see what he's saying or you see what I mean. So the people see or understand that Moshe is delayed from coming. Now, I want to give a quick example. Let me stop the share for a minute. The people for sure will wait a couple days. They know he's gone for more than a day or two, for sure a week, 2 weeks. For sure, they're not going to wait 5 years. Everyone agree? 5 years is too long. 1 week is too short. Got it? Somewhere between a week and 5 years, they're going to come to what conclusion? He's not coming back. I should have said they could wait 100 years. They're not going to wait 100 years. They're not going to wait 1 year. But they can wait a week or two. At some point between a week or two and a year, got it? They're going to have to reach what conclusion if he doesn't come down? He's not coming back again. What's the proof? He didn't come back yesterday. Why should he come back tomorrow? He's never left for so long before. In fact, the last time he left was like for some 60 years in Midian. Who knows? Maybe they think he went back to Midian. Maybe he ran away. Maybe, who knows what happened. But they don't say he died, but they say he's not coming back. And what's the proof he's not coming back? He didn't come back. I'm just saying it's very logical for the people to assume that Moshe is not coming back. Now, if that's the case, what are their options? Assuming Moshe is not coming back, how many options do they have? As a nation, forget who they should go to. For sure, they should go to Aaron. But think the nation as a nation. What decision did they have to make? We could stay where we are, but that we can't stay where we are forever. We're not going to stay in the desert forever. We could go back to Egypt. So they've been there, done that. And maybe we could have come back to thing, or we can go to Israel. Got it? Debbie's asking whether they knew that there was something, whether they knew about typological numbers. Again, if Moshe didn't tell them, coming down for 40 days, and if they maybe just got the story of the flood recently, how much they studied it, I'm not sure, and they didn't read the story about Chet Ego yet. So I don't think that they would expect on day 40 something special would happen. But what I'm trying to explain is staying where you are forever is impossible. Going back to Egypt is not the greatest, but going to Israel could be expected, but it's dangerous. Why? Because how are you going to conquer the 7 nations? Well, what's the last thing they heard from God? The last thing they heard from God is he'll help them conquer the nation. He'll send a malach. Who is supposed to be the malach? Moshe Rabbeinu. Got it? But Moshe is gone. So what do they need basically? They need a malach asher yelech lefanenu. Got it? Now, is it someone human? Someone not human? Well, we saw what happened in there. What happened to this human malach? Maybe consumed by fire. Maybe we're not sure what we want, but they should go to Aaron. And Aaron also doesn't know. Aaron doesn't tell them, wait another day or two. Maybe he did beforehand. But Aaron doesn't say, I know he's coming down, just be patient, because he doesn't know either, Mshad. And Aaron can't do nothing, and therefore he has to do something. So let's see what he does. What he does, I think, makes a lot of sense. And pay attention to the story now, what Aaron's doing. So the people gather on Aaron, and what do they say? Elohim asher yachul lefanenu. We'll make a big deal about this, but to appreciate what they're saying, they don't say, Kumasei lenu Elohim, or make us another God. Elohim in Parshat Mishpatim meant also a judge or a power. Remember, Elim lo tkalel v'nasib amchad lo ta'or. A leader, anyone with power can be called Elohim. A judge is called Elohim. Remember? Ad Elohim yivol devar shneim asher yashinu Elohim. Chumash already used, and Am Yisrael already heard the name Elohim. They're referring to anyone powerful. And therefore, they want a leader of some sort, or something, some symbol of something, which will lead the way to the land of Israel. Why? If Moshe came down, we would need this Elohim Asher, because Moshe Asher Yachol Lefanenu, he'll lead the way. But because Moshe is not here, the Moshe took us out of Egypt and was a malach up until now. And what I'm trying to say is the people are asking for the malach, and they want either Aaron to be a malach or provide a malach. I think Aaron understands the same thing. So what's Aaron say to do? Aaron clearly wants to make a symbol of God for the sake of the people. Follow what he does. He asks the people for their gold. They're more than happy to donate. Right? People took off the gold from their children that they took out of Egypt. There's something cute that happens here, because how did they get all this gold? They got the gold when they left Egypt, didn't they? Remember, they left Egypt to borrow the gold? So the gold didn't take them out of Egypt, but the gold came out of Egypt with them. And that's not what they say. What does Aaron do? Aaron takes the gold. He fashions it, makes some type of mold. And Vayasehu, that's Aaron, right? It's not Vayasu, Vayasehu. Aaron makes the egel. A masechaz, it's some type of mask or something representing something else. But it's Aaron's idea to make an egel. Now, God didn't say yet, Elohim masecha lo taselach. We read that on Yom Tov. I think we read on, that's a Chol Hamoed reading from Kitisa, and we're going to read the Shabbat, Elohim masecha lo taselach. But the Yisur of Eloi Masecha Lo Tansalach is only after Chet HaEgel. What I'm trying to show you, Aaron thinks he's doing the right thing. Aaron believes in God. The people believe in God. And what they want is something either to remind them of God, but something that's going to lead them to the land of Israel. And therefore, Aaron's idea is to make something out of gold, shaped like an egel. Okay? And then after he makes it, what do the people say? Remember, a minute ago, they said that Moshe took them out of Egypt. And what are they saying now? Now they say, now, they can't mean that this piece of gold took them out of Egypt, because they're not that ridiculous. We'll see the Ramban. He says they can't be that stupid, but rather that this golden image, this golden calf, is going to represent for them and remind them and be that, hopefully, that malach that will lead them and help them conquer the land of Israel. Now, that's pretty much what Aaron wanted, but it wasn't. He wants to make sure they understand that this egel is simply representing God. Well, what do you do to make sure an item represents God? Aaron sees what's happening. Vaya Aaron, he understands. He builds a mizbech in front of the egel. He calls to the people and says, Chag Lashem Machar, we're having a celebration for God. It's clear they believe in God. And it's clear they're doing the same thing they did by Har Sinai. But to clarify to the people that this egel is representing God, who took them out of Egypt, who's going to bring them to Israel, he's going to have a national celebration, just like Har Sinai, and build a altar in front of it and declare this will be a celebration for God. And just like at Har Sinai, they get up in the morning, they bring olot and shlamim, remember? And the people sit down to eat and drink. He had all these words before. And the big change is by Yakumu Litzachek, what's called a contrasting parallel. Everything's parallel except for they get up to laugh. Whatever that means, we'll deal with in a minute. So I want to review all the parallels we've seen. What were the parallels? From, again, the story of Chet HaEgel to Parshat Mishpatim. So what's my point in study? If I want to study Chet HaEgel, if I just start reading Parshat Kitisa by itself and don't take into consideration Parshat Mishpatim, okay, it'll be very difficult to really understand what's happening. That's my key point. To appreciate what's happening, I have to read Parshat Kitisa as a continuation of Parshat Mishpatim. And when I understand units, it's clear that there's a unit inserted in between. The Mishkan, commandment to build the Mishkan, is inserted. Now, when that insertion was actually given to Moshe Rabbeinu, you can argue. That's a big argument between Rashi and Ramban. But from a narrative point of view, it's impossible to read the story of Chet HaEgel without Parshat Mishpatim and realizing how it's a continuous narrative. That's the methodology I'm trying to explain. Now, why do people see that Moshe is delayed? Because remember, the people last saw Moshe go into the cloud. Remember, he said, Adashir Neshuv Aleichem. And they see Moshe going to this ball of fire, or they see the ball of fire in the mountain, and Moshe goes up to it. And Moshe told them to go to Aaron Chor, and sure enough, they go to Aaron. Just on an aside, if you remember from, there's a famous midrash that the people killed Chor because he said no. So that's a classic example of beautiful midrash. Why? Because Aaron and Chor were Moshe's right hand and left hand men. Remember, with Amalek, we see Aaron and Chor as co-leaders, and for some strange reason, Chor disappears from Chumash. That's it. We never hear about him again. Question number one, what happened to Chor? Question number two, why does Aaron give it to the people? How does the midrash solve the problem? Well, they must have asked Chor and they killed Chor, and that's why that explains why he's gone, and that explains why Aaron says yes. Is that pshat? I wouldn't say it's simple pshat, but it's definitely it's a midrash that definitely tries to solve a problem with pshat. Now, let's continue. What did the people say? Remember we saw in Perachab Gimel? God said, to bring you to the place Asher Achinoti. Remember? Now bring you. So therefore, what did the people say? I think it's so obvious. I hope everyone agrees that you can't read the story, the people's request of Elohim Asher Yechul Lefanenu without taking into consideration what God promised them in Parshat Mishpatim, which was God talking to the people. They simply want the malach that God promised because they want to conquer the land. Why? Who is supposed to be the malach Moshe? Kizeh Moshe Ha'ish. Now Moshe is immortal. We don't know what happened to him. Now they don't know he died, so they don't say he died, but they assume he's not coming back. Now, if this all makes so much sense, so why is God so angry? That's the big question. Pretty much Ramban and Rabbi Levi followed this direction. Many Parshanim go in this direction that Aaron meant well. and no one's believing in other gods, but rather it's serving our God somehow the wrong way. But if that's all it is, why is God so angry that we have to deal with now? So let's see what happens next. Back to our mouse. Okay, so Aaron makes the Egel Masecha. And we saw before, Aaron builds a Mizbech in front of it. What did we see? Back in Har Sinai in chapter 24, in Moshe built a Mizbech on the bottom of the mountain, 12 matzevot representing the people. They brought olot and shlamim, just like here, olot and shlamim. I should put my little arrows again. Let me move this up a little bit, and we'll do our little arrows just to highlight what we've been talking about. Make the arrows maybe red. So the Mizbech and the Mizbech, olot and shlamim, olot, shlamim, just to make it nice and simple. And what they do, by chlu vayishtu, by lechol b'shato. Got it. So I think that should be obvious now. When you do the comparison, you can't miss that Aaron is trying to recreate the experience from Har Sinai to the people. Now, what's the big difference, which is called a contrasting parallel? By kuma letzachek has to be the problem. It's not making the ego that's the problem. It's the laughter, the frivolous behavior. What it means is that, remember, the rabbis bring up all three possibilities. Idol worship, remember? Gilui Arayot, Shfichut Damim, and Avodah Zarah. Were they killing each other? I'm not sure why they would do that. Are they, is it Arayot? Was it what they call Wasin? Maybe there was mixed dancing. But something is bad with their behavior. I want to take it from a bit of a different angle in a minute. So basically, that's the, let's clear the drawings. That's a review of all the parallels we saw. And that was my first key point about how you need to understand Parsha Kitisa from Parsha Mishpatim. Now, why does Aaron make, I want to go back to this point here. Remember, what did the people see? The elders of Israel, the last thing they saw was this vision of God and the bottom of God's feet. That's why I mentioned before, what did they see? What's Tachat Raglav? As you mentioned, not Tachat Raglav, but Tachat Raglav, of this God of Israel. What's the bottom of his feet?
The floor.
So, yeah. So if we read in Yechezkel, remember Yechezkel has a vision of God's chariot, Perek Aleph in Yechezkel. What does God see? He sees God coming, some storm from the north. Anan Gadol ve'esh, just like Har Sinai. He sees vision of cloud and fire and a halo around it, something electrifying, and some vision inside of some four animals, whatever they look like, and with four faces. And the main line, whatever this looked like, the bottom, Bragleim Regli Shara, the bottom of the feet of all these four faces was straight because of this pasuk. We keep our feet together for Shemona Esrei. And the bottom of their feet looked like the bottom of an egel. So some Parshanim, I think Chizkuni alludes to it, but from a different angle. But I simply want to point out that if the elders of Israel, including Aaron and the elders, who Moshe told them he's coming back soon, but they didn't come back, if the last thing they saw, they had this vision of God, and this is what God looks like in a vision, then maybe they're making this symbol of God that reminds them of what happened. Now, I want to give you a little analogy from my experience in one-year gap programs. It's called the sweatshirt at the end of the year. Everyone knows what sweatshirts are, right? Every gap year program, no matter, and sometimes even at the end of summer camp, but if you're in a year program, what does everyone do at the end of the year? They have a group sweatshirt, right? Now, no one who's here for the year, right, needs another sweatshirt. At home, they have 20 in their closet. In Israel, they have another 4 or 5 they brought with them. No one needs a sweatshirt. What they do need, they need a physical symbol of their year in Israel. Okay? So it's not the sweatshirt that they need what's printed on the sweatshirt. So someone in the class or some group in the class is going to have a design. And on the design, they're going to be items that remind them of their experience, right? So last year it was a vaccine. This year will probably be an antigen test. It'll remind them of their experience. They might have, some might be guys playing basketball. Some of the guys might be sitting in a base medrash. Probably there'll be a daf gemara somewhere. Whatever masechet they were learning that year, that masechet will be on the sweatshirt. There'll be something about Tulim. There'll be something that probably only the people in the group would understand the depth of it or something. What I'm getting at is that it's not so much, again, no one looks at a sweatshirt and thinks a sweatshirt has any magical powers. But when you look at the sweatshirt, it reminds you of that experience. And that's what people need. Just like someone brought the example, like Brita Keshet. It's an oath brit. It's a reminder of a thing. But that's human nature. Now, what's important is, what is your symbol of God? So I think from Rabbi Ben a beautiful explanation where I'll bring an example from, I was one time in Richmond, Virginia, and I don't know if you've been there, but they give you the royal tour of Richmond, Virginia, and every couple of blocks, the center of the street is a hero from the Civil War. Remember, every general, Robert E. Lee's there, I guess, I'm sure all the generals, who else is there? Stonewall Jackson, right? All the great heroes. And they're all sitting on horses, holding a sword, whatever they're doing, but everyone's mounted on a horse. No one's standing, no one's standing, with his hands folded. That's no one's sitting on a chair with his hands folded. That's Lincoln Memorial. But the generals of the Civil War, they're all on their horses. Why? Because gods ride on horses. Got it? Generals, ride on horses. In ancient times, gods rode on animals. And usually it was a cow or a calf or an ox or something like that. Ox could be a sign of power. You have that, like in figurines, you have many times, you have especially the Baal god, the rain god, or the war god, whatever he is. But you have gods riding on animals. And basically the animal is a pedestal. So I think I heard this from Rabbi Ben, is that if I have a pedestal with nothing on it, let's say there was a general who was invisible. So how would I show an invisible general? Have a horse with no one on it. Now, and that was the spirit of God who helped us, win the war or something like that. So if I want to represent a God that's invisible, so I have a pedestal with nothing on it. So that's another way of looking at it. Or it could be, maybe in Egypt, that was like Egyptian cultures, we'll talk about it in a minute. But for some reason, at least Aaron thought it was a good idea. Now, as a friend of mine once told me, there's no good deeds go unpunished. You always mean to do well, but you always end up messing up. There's no doubt Aaron meant well, and he believes in God, and he thought he was doing the right thing. It turned out to be bad, but we'll see what happened, what caused it to be bad. But what I want to claim is it's not a theological problem, it's a behavioral problem. Because believing in God in Chumash, I tried to explain that when we did Sefer Bereshit, is that a belief in God is not necessarily, you have to be like Aristotle and be able to prove that God exists and have this intellectual understanding of there has to be a God, like deductive reasoning, and go have a class in philosophy. But there's a God. It's how you behave. And the fear of God, remember Yirat Elohim? It's the understanding that God wants you to behave properly. And the understanding that Hashem is your God, and you made a covenant in Har Sinai, it's not remembering that God took you out of Egypt. I need a symbol to remember why he took you out of Egypt. Now, the question is, what's on the people's mind? Is on the people's mind the desire to be God's nation and represent him? Or is on the people's mind is to conquer the land of Israel and become king on the hill and oppress other people like what Egypt did to them? Is the goal of the people, we suffered for hundreds of years in Egypt. Now we get to have our own land and we can oppress other people. Or is our goal to set up a nation, to be a model nation and not act like the Egyptians? And that's the big question. And again, one more example from gap years in Israel. You can have an amazing Elul Zman, the first 4 or 5 weeks, and then great Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening. And the guys are all into it, turned all in the leaf. And a week later, Chol Hamoed Sukkos, they hang out there. Some parents have an apartment. This one has a hotel, and they have parties. And then there goes Zman Elul, down the drain. Now, if they were like, yeshiva guys beforehand, that's one thing. But they're going back to the way they were in high school, assuming taking just normal American kids. But again, I have too much experience with this stuff. But everyone can understand the analogy. Meaning, if you're coming, that's why it's so important to understand back to Parshat Aaron coming out of Egypt. If Am Yisrael wasn't ready for redemption before they left Egypt, and that was clear, we saw that in Yechezkel. And if God had to put them through all these experiences to get them ready to become God's people, and basically when we left Egypt, we weren't ready. Chumash alludes to that. Yechezkel screams it. And all the events that God's doing from the time we leave Egypt till we get to Har Sinai was to train them. We had Korban Pesach, remember? And it's all symbolism. We had the experience of splitting in the sea. We had the manna experience, an educational experience. We had the waters in Marah. We had, the war with Amalek. And then finally we get to Har Sinai and say, okay, Nasa Benishma. The question is, does it all fall apart? When it all falls apart, are they going to revert back to their bad behavior? And one way to look at it is that God is leaving Moshe Rabbeinu up on Har Sinai for how long? Until something goes wrong or something goes right. God wants him to have a party. God wants them to celebrate, and He's going to test them by how they celebrate. So that's why I was saying this Vayikumu L'Tzachek could simply be alluding to what? To simply frivolous behavior, just getting wild, not becoming of what they call nowadays yeshiva bachur. Again, I'm using maybe too much of an analogy to modern day experiences, but what I'm trying to get at, and I want to prove it from the rest of the story, is that what God is angry with, and Moshe as well, is not simply the fact that they made a golden calf. Otherwise, Aaron wouldn't be promoted for doing such a terrible sin. Aaron meant well, but the people's behavior and how they celebrated the party, that showed God they're not ready yet to be His people. And because we're about to go to Israel, and we'll be in Israel once we conquer the land, Moshe won't be around 24/7. You won't have a mashgiach watching. You won't be in this camp with God's Shekhinah next to you all the time. Everyone will be on their own. Are the people ready yet to become a nation representing God? And the way they act at Chet Ego is simply an indicator to God. God sees or understands the people can change. Or in the words of Chumash, that's a stiff-necked people, an Amkshe Oref. Someone that can't change their ways is stiff-necked. It's not a chiropractor problem that the people have a stiff neck. Someone with a stiff neck can't change direction. God was trying to get them to change direction. And what does God realize after 2 months of 2-3 months since we left Egypt? This nation is not ready. And again, if you look, remember Yechezkel chapter 20, just have to read it and you see that's exactly what Yechezkel was telling the people hundreds of years later. And it seems to be everyone knew that we weren't ready. And it proves themselves, that generation proved themselves later with the sin of with the sin of the spies. The generation simply wasn't ready. God tried. We tried our best, but it didn't work. Now, I want to prove this from the rest of the story. So let's pick up the story now and share my screen again. And let's continue. Okay, I'll just read quickly Ramban on Asayla. There's just one line of the Ramban. When the people say Elohecha Yisrael, just want to show you Asher Elucha. He says, Gam zeh katuv yireh otanu, ki ein tipesh ba'olam she'achshov ki hazahav hazeh asher haya ba'oznehem hu asher hotzeh miMitzrayim. He says, no one can be so foolish. He uses the word tipesh here. He says, no one can be so foolish to think that this gold that was a day ago on the ears of their children is the God that took them out of Egypt. He says, it can't mean that. Because what came out of Egypt, the power represented by the shape. There's some shape, there's some power behind the shape. So I use that sweatshirt analogy. There's something in anything. Remember, take anything that represents a God. So in any type of idol worship, the item represents a God, but it represents a certain power. It could be a power of nature, but it's that gold is now representing the power that took them out of Egypt, whatever that power was. Okay. They never say the ego took them out of Egypt. Only it's representing the God that took them out of Egypt, or the power. Okay. They believe in God, Ramban says, and about His great name that took them out of Egypt. Okay. But basically, so Ramban tries to explain how they misunderstood this idea of God. So what I want to I want to simply use the first part of the Ramban and to support the idea that it can't be they're believing in other gods. They don't believe in another God, they believe in our God, but their understanding of God. What I want to move to is that their understanding of a God is a God working for them and not they're working for God. They don't see themselves ready now to be a nation in the service of God. They just see God having, like, remember Raiders of the Lost Ark? Oh, if we have this ego, he'll have superpowers, and the same superpowers that took us out of Egypt, those superpowers are now transferred to this ego, and now we have this really cool tank that can help us take over Ukraine. It can help us take over the 7 nations, and nothing to fear. And that's what they want. They need that help to conquer the land. But that's the big question. Is their goal to be a nation representing God? Or is their goal to be, just to be another nation, and they want God to work for them? And how can you judge that? By their behavior and the way they act at the party. Now let's continue for a minute and take a look at what happens next. Okay. What did God say? Why? Have we ever had the word in Chumash Shechei Tamcha before? Where do we have Hashchata earlier?
Flood.
No.
At the flood, right? Now, what type of behavior was that?
Right.
What did God see? God see the people's behavior was corrupt. Like Mother Eretz Hamas, remember? There was iniquity. Hashchata is bad behavior. That's for sure. That's what it meant by the flood. It's not idol worship. It's simply bad behavior. And we'll talk about next week, we'll talk about the parallels between the flood and Har Sinai. We're going to talk about intertextually between books, how I have to read. We'll talk about what came first, Shemot or Bereshit, we'll see. But the idea that the word hashchata means something about the behavior, in other words, what I want to do here, I want to put a comma between each phrase. Let me go back to my screen. You see what I mean? Go down because your people are acting bad, right? They've gone down. The people you took out of Egypt, okay? Saru min haderech asher tzivitim. Now, I want to claim that this stands alone. This isn't describing the ego, but this is describing their behavior. Now, does anyone remember where do we have a definition of what is derech Hashem? They went away from derech asher. Where did God command them about a derech? Anyone ever read a book about that?
Abraham.
Yeah, what did God remember? Remember in Sefer Dvarim, Balachta b'drachav, L'lecha b'darchei Hashem. You say it in Shema, L'lecha b'chol drachav.
Right.
So they're not acting in a way that there's hashchata. They're not acting the way that I commanded them. Their behavior is something. And on top of that, Asula mega masecha. So, okay, that was Aaron's idea, but what did they do? They bowed down to it. Vayishtachavu lo. Vayizbechu lo. Okay? And they started screaming, oh, this is God taking it out of Egypt. What I want to point out is that they're bowing down to it as opposed to what it represents. Meaning, it's the power. Again, I just want to use the Raiders of the Last Ark as my analogy. They say, oh, wow, we have this new tank. We have this new fighter plane. We have this new tool that will help us conquer the land. And they're so excited. Hey, we found, remember, since they left Egypt, what had they been told by God? But remember, they were never interested in leaving Egypt. They wanted a lighter workload. What did God tell them? I'm going to take you to a better place. But I'm taking you I'm bringing you to the land of Israel, Eretz Zabat Chalad Udvash, a land flowing in milk and honey. And you be your own nation there. He never told them we're going to be in the desert for a couple months. He never said we're going to Har Sinai, maybe to bring korbanot. Okay, so we got to Har Sinai. But no one in Har Sinai was expecting to wait for another month or two to go to Israel. We're supposed to go to, that's what God said, I'm going to send a malach and bring you. No one expecting to wait a month, a year, for sure not 40 years. And therefore, they're just itching to go to Israel. And they've been waiting for a week, 2, 3, 4 weeks already. They want to go already. And now they're so excited. Now what Aaron made can lead them to Israel. But again, the way they behave at the party, I think that's what's going to get God so angry. Because what does God say now? What's God tell Moshe Rabbeinu? Ra'iti. See the word ra'ah again? I should have done it in blue. It's that God recognizes. Remember, the people see Vayar Ha'am, then Vayar Aaron, now Vayar Hashem sees. Means he reaches the conclusion. They're an Am Kshe'oraf, they can't change. It's not going to work with this nation. And that's going to be a given. That we basically can't turn them around. That's the way they are. And therefore, God still has to keep his covenant with his, God still has to keep the covenant with the people. With Avram Avinu to give them the land. So for what's God tell Moshe Rabbeinu? Now allow me, let me get my anger at them and punish them, eat them up. And I'll make you a great nation. I'll make you the great nation. Remember, that's what God promised Avram Avinu. God can't break his promise to our forefathers, but he can fulfill that promise through Moshe or through people like Moshe. Now, I'm going to stop here, Moshe. I'm not going to skip Moshe's davening now. We don't have time for that now. Moshe prays. When that happened, big argument, but Moshe holds up the punishment. But basically, the covenant of Har Sinai is going to be broken because of their behavior. Now let's get to, okay, I want to put the screen back on. I want to pick up the story when Moshe comes down and what he sees to prove my point. Let's see what happens when Moshe encounters Aaron. What's he charge Aaron with? Does he blame Aaron? Let's see what happens. So Moshe comes down the mountain with the 2 luchot. Okay, we'll skip all that. Yeshua hears the loud voice of the people. He hears, Re'el means loud noise, like hooray. It's like anamanapia. Here's the people screaming and yelling. What's that a sign of? That's a sign of a wild party. It's so wild that what? He tells Moshe, it sounds like there's a war going on. Got it? And what's Moshe tell Yeshua? Because God told him already that they've been bad. He says, that's not the sound of war, of winners and losers. That's not like tug of war, where the people winning are screaming and the people losing are screaming. Remember the, like in a ball game kind of thing, where you hear all the cheers of the winners and the groans of the losers. That's not like in war, but rather, kol anot, it's just simply a loud noise. Just noise of the singing out, like loud singing, and that's it. Again, indicator of a loud party. Moshe comes down, and what does he see? He sees not just the egel, also the macholot. I was joking, the mixed dancing. Whatever. Now, there's nothing wrong with dancing. The question, what are they dancing about and how they're dancing? God gets angry, and Moshe says, breaks the luchot. Maybe that's a sign that they can't live up to this brit. Okay, whatever Moshe does to the egel, we'll deal with later on. And listen how he encounters Aaron. Vayomer Moshe el Aaron, Ma asalacha ha'am hazeh ki heveit elav chatat gedola. What's he saying? What did the people do to you that you caused them to sin? Moshe doesn't accuse Aaron of sinning. He didn't say, how did you make it idol worship? He says, what did you do that you caused them to sin? So Aaron didn't sin. That's my point. If the sin is the calf itself, got it? Then he wouldn't say, Aaron, what did you do causing them to sin? He would say, Aaron, what did you do wrong? Why did you sin? No, he said, you did something, you had a good idea, you had good intentions, but it went sour. What did you do to cause the people to sin? And Aaron's going to blame it on Moshe. What's Aaron say? Don't get angry at me. You know the campers. You know they're bad. You saw them in Egypt. You saw them in the desert. You know, like I know. What did you expect is going to happen? Okay? And they told me I had to do something. Remember, Asher Yechula Fanenu? That was our whole shir beforehand. Okay, why? Because you didn't come back. Remember, you promised us before you left. You promised God will send a malach to lead us to Israel. We thought it was you. You didn't come back. It's your fault. I had to do something. So basically, Aaron's blaming on Moshe why he did something. I couldn't do nothing. I had to do something. I made this, but you know the people. What you expect was going to happen? Okay, and he told him without going what he meant by how the egel was made. Okay, now listen carefully. Vayar Moshe et ha'am ki parohu. That's my anchor. What conclusion does Moshe reach? What does Moshe see and understand about the people? They're parua. Parua means wild, right? He didn't say, "Oh, you believe in other gods." He didn't say, "Oh, you have wrong theology. You're a koifer now. Or you believe in a Trinity, or you believe in Buddha or something." He's not complaining about their beliefs. Of course, rather he's complaining about their behavior. The people are parua. They're wild. Who caused them to get wild? Keep pro Aaron. To the disgrace, either before their enemies, as most people are trying to, or maybe it goes back to Vayikum Tzachek. But see the word paro hiding in this word, going back to Egyptian culture.
Paro.
That's a key point I want to make, is that in this story, what do I see? I see a behavior problem, and later we'll see why it almost was bound to happen one way or the other. But it's not that the people are sinning in this theological misunderstanding of God or believing in other gods. They know God took them out of Egypt. They know there's this God. The question is how they understand God, how they understand their responsibility to act as God's people. And in the way they're behaving in the party, that's the indicator that something's wrong. They're not ready yet to go into Israel, and God can't bring them to Israel until they fix it. Now, next week we're going to talk about, we'll take this from a bit of a different angle, where if I just read the story the way we did now, let me summarize what I tried to do today. I try to show you that if I just read the story of Chet Egel, it sounds really strange. Out of nowhere, Aaron makes another god, and they serve other gods, and they go against the second commandment, and their whole belief in what happened in Egypt is gone. It just doesn't make sense. If I read the story together with Parshat Mishpatim and place myself in the mind of the people and the setting and what they've gone through, what almost everyone's doing makes sense. It makes sense what God's up to. It makes sense what happened to people. It makes sense what Aaron's doing. And it's basically, it's simply said what happened. It's a tragedy. Now, next week, we take this to a different step where there's too many parallels between this story and the story of the flood. We mentioned the first one. But there's the 40 days and 40 nights. And there's this idea of a brit that will come, the brit before and the brit afterhand. If you remember the flood story, the key thing we'll see next time is that God, this pattern goes on and on ever since Gan Eden. God sets man up, man fails, and then reestablish a relationship. So the idea that there's a flood and God decides, to punish, and after the flood's over, God decides, I'm not going to do that again, and makes a new brit with being more merciful. Remember? Understanding that man can sin. Remember? Ki yetzer adam ra minu rav, as opposed to rak halayom. We'll see that more in detail next week. There are too many parallels between the flood story and the Chet Egel story to think that this is simply a comedy of errors. What wrong? But it's almost something that had to happen because God needs to get to the second luchot. It wouldn't have been this sin, it would have been a different sin. But what I want to get to is that, again, I'm not studying what happened, but what's written. If I understand, I'm going to go back to have a different understanding of Sefer Bereshit and when Bereshit was given. But I want to use Sefer Bereshit to re-examine the whole story of Chet Egel in light of the covenant that God makes after Chet Egel, which is, it's the endpoint we would have to get to no matter what. I'll give you an example. We know that sooner or later, Am Yisrael, the offspring of Avram, has to go through some type of oppression and redemption, and only later they'll get the land of Israel. Remember Brit Ben Avtarim? How to play itself out? Did the brothers have to sell Yosef for that to happen? Did it have to be so harsh? I know where I'm starting. I know where I'm ending. How we get from A to B, remember on Google when you do because there's different routes to get there. So what I'm getting at, I know sooner or later that the 10 Commandments with their Midot Adin can't last. There's no human who could survive that. Sooner or later, we need to get to Midot Rachamim, God's attributes of mercy. But the story that unfolds will be key to understanding and appreciating God's attributes of mercy, which are the key to our relationship with God, and we'll see later to the key to religion. So we'll take this at not a totally different level. I want to do it from a totally different angle next week in light of Sefer Bereshit. But today somebody want to do it in light of Sefer Parshat Mishpatim. Okay. What's the okay? I'll just tell the last question from Marvin. What's the fact that my final proof? I'll go to the chat in a minute. My final proof, it's the people's behavior is the last line. Remember, word Vayar means you reach a conclusion. Remember, God saw that the people are amkshor, they don't change. Aaron saw what the thing, and he put him back to make sure they knew it was for God. The people saw and understood that Moshe is not coming down. Kiboshesh Moshe. So when you reach a conclusion, what happens? Moshe sees the people are what? Are parua. It means wild. Okay. And Aaron caused them to get wild, but Aaron wasn't wild, but Aaron meant well, but his actions caused them to get wild. But and therefore, then we'll see we have to punish the people who spiked the drinks and changed the music. There's the troublemakers and the followers. We had to find, there'll be a tribunal to figure out who are the rotten cores, who we have to throw out of school, and everyone else is going to be in suspension. Whatever it's called, suspended or on trial until they're I forgot what it's called in English. It's called masal. It's you're on trial, sort of, until you fix your ways. One other thing I wanted to explain was that was that question. I think that was my strongest point, and the fact that he does. I'm saying at the end of the day, Aaron gets promoted, doesn't he? Aaron's going to be, because he made a mistake, even though he meant well. That we'll see how everything now will be. Let's do it the right way, and we'll see next week how the egel will be the Mishkan will be a kosher egel, basically. And we have to go back to that sweatshirt analogy of what's about symbolism. But let me go down to the chat now and answer the questions and get back. We'll start with the source sheets. Okay, we got the source sheets. Okay. The whole topic, what angels are, that's a great topic. Are there really angels or are angels human beings? It goes back to the story of Abraham and the angels, stone, but we'll leave for now. We did that one. Okay, we talked about 40 days. Okay. Was it a mistake to leave the people sit idle instead of being occupied with the task? Okay. Of course, I'm not, again, I'll take Ibat's question. Was it a mistake to leave the people sitting idle instead of giving them a task? I'll use my approach all the time. I'm not reading Chumash and giving God a grade. Oh, God, you did a lousy job. You shouldn't have done that. You should have been nicer. I'm saying I'm studying what happened. I'm studying what's written, and I want to learn from the story. How did the story help me understand better why God gave us the Torah and potential problems? Again, Chumash isn't a fairy tale, so maybe God could have done a better job. Why couldn't God put us not in Egypt? Why couldn't we be with Lavan somewhere in Mesopotamia better? It always could have been different. Why couldn't God pick? Why could it be 6 tribes instead of 12 tribes or something? God could have done something different, but the fact he could have done different doesn't mean he didn't do what he did do. I just try to explain what he did do. That's a general question. Okay. They could have made Aaron their leader, but they didn't. That's what Aaron was their leader, but Aaron didn't want to be the leader, or he thinks we need something. It makes sense that we want some symbol. People always need symbols. We'll see later on. Again, I'm going to next week's share, but the Aaron that we make out of our gold is going to lead us to the land of Israel and conquer the land, isn't it? Remember, if they want something out of gold that's going to lead them and help them conquer the land of Israel, that's exactly what the Aaron is later on. The Aaron leads the way crosses the Jordan. Ever? Again, I'm going to next week's share. But we'll see. But the Mishkan ends up being this action, but with the right direction, with the thing. I'll give you let me give you one more analogy from Kiddush Club and Shul. I call Chet Egel the first Kiddush Club. In what way? If you go to Shul and Daven and hear Kriyas Torah and hear the rabbi's speech and are inspired to be a good Jew, and then you go to a Kiddush, even a Fleisha Kiddush, and enjoy and happy, that's fine. When you come to Shul and don't go to Torah reading, and you don't hear the rabbi's speech, you just come for the Kiddush Club, got it? And you're coming for Schnapps and Lashon Hara, and that's your Shul experience, and you claim to be God, and you're wearing a kippah, got it? And that's a disaster. So in the parallel between Parshat Mishpatim in here, so we have the eating and drinking, and we have the celebration, but what's missing? We're missing the Sefer Abrit, we're missing the Nasa V'Nishma, we're missing Parshat Mishpatim, you follow? We're missing the rabbi's speech in Kriyas Torah. That's what we're missing. And that's what happens when you come to Shul just for Kiddush Club, but that was a little thing. Okay. Got it. Okay. Okay, we get about the snake symbol. Again, that's a good question, but again, you have symbols all the time. But again, the copper snake is later on in Chumash. But remember, we have Moshe's hand or Moshe's staff going up, remember, in the war with Amalek. Moshe's hand doesn't win a war, but what it represents. Forget Chumash, learn Chumash, but remember, I guess The Patriot, I think that was a movie. What happens? Someone has to hold that flag and wave it to rally the troops. Remember? You have to look at something in the Roman army. Remember the person holding the symbol of the legion was the most important job?
The eagle.
Yeah, and he was the first target of the enemy because that's what inspires the people. So there's something about symbols that inspire people. The question is, what does your symbol remind you of? Of that you have magic powers or that you have to serve God properly? Okay. Again, what's wrong with the golden calf? Again, we'll do with the IBAT's question. I'll get to next week already, what it represents and about the need for an intermarry. Okay. The Madidi says about when they bring Yosef's bones with the Alei Shor, that's the road of Midrash, which is fine, but I'm trying to state a pshat. For sure, there's a lot of symbolism in Yosef's bones coming out of Egypt. And Yosef has all these parallels to Moshe Rabbeinu, but thing. And then we had our little rainbow for the sign. Okay, what's this? Okay. The garden too, okay. MJ's back, okay. Hashem accused people of worshiping Hashem. Oh yeah, and Pasuk 8. That I read Pasuk 8. I think about B'chulo. Now the question is when God's complaining that they serving the thing. The question is that was one of the three things they did wrong. What I'm saying, shichet and Sorma Derech are not introductions to Chet Egel, but they're bad behavior itself. Problem number one. Sorma Derech problem number two. And to make Egel that are meant, they bowed down to it. And that's what happens when you misunderstand your religion. The symbols of God become gods, and that God's working for you. So I can be a rotten person, but put a petik in the kotel, and the kotel's got magic powers, and I'll get a thing. I can be rotten in business, but I'll go to Shul on Yom Kippur and get psicha for Nila, and my business will be blessed. Okay? And if I did bad things this year, I'll double my donation to the Shul. And the rabbi will atone me for my sins, kind of idea. Everyone's familiar with things like that. It's a shame, but that's what's happening here is the classic danger of religion and ritual is misunderstood. Okay, we answered that question. There's tons of sota, what do you call it? Which goes back to lack of trust. For sure, they have a lot of, not only by the parua, you also have, the question is this like the sota, or is the sota a model from here of a lack of trust, a lack of understanding? But Moshe grinding up the egel and putting it into the water, making the people drink the water. That's the and the parua puts sota here, like for sure is based on this. Okay, and okay, Kiddush Chab and Haftarah, that's very good. Okay. Haftarah, that's right. Haftarah is another type of rabbi speech already. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm overtime again. So we'll stop here.
Thank you. You're only 5 minutes overtime this week. We're under time over.
Oh, we're under time. Okay.
Okay. I'll thank you very much.